my ability, not trying to speak for Walter Williams.
Of course.
My assumption through his information is that we've been taught that the Bible has been written by inspired men. More specifically, we have been told that the authors of the books are those individuals they say the names of: the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Luke, Matthew, Mark. And what Walter Williams is saying is that this is not true. Traditionally, we taught that it was 30 years prior that the books was written. But what Walter Williams is saying is that this is inaccurate because these books are recent and they don't date back. So he's calling this misinformation because this is what we taught. He even talks about at a particular time, one of the first European institutions was the Hagia Sophia. And the Hagia Sophia was one of the first collegial institutions for Europeans. And what they taught through the Bible historically, because the Bible had some aspect of countries and lands, or so far as these created lands. But historically, when we research those lands, they don't exist in actual accounts. So that's what the information.
They don't even exist through translations of anything, because most definitely in our history, certain places have gone through numerous name changes from them being conquered or taken over or what have you. So absolutely. Are you saying that through our research, the names of these places were never found?
Well, not necessarily saying that they were never found, but what he's saying is that, for example, you have an area where they say, okay, this is the land of Mesopotamia. Okay. Now, when we look at it, we say, well, no, historically, this has always been given this name. Like when he talks about, in the historical orchard of Islam, he talks about Mecca and Medina. And he says that, essentially, or example of misinformation, let's switch that, let's talk about the pilgrimage to Medina and Mecca. And he's saying that the Hajj was always traditionally considered to be the pilgrimage to that area, to that holy land. But historically, we come to find out that actually this land was not fruitful, that it was a barren place. Now, usually holy places of that of fruitfulness, because it's symbolic to that of life. And what he's saying is that there are a lot of contradictions that leave ambiguous, and historically when we research that, it shows no connection to what the traditional perspectives is, and meaning that the traditional perspectives are inspired through the biblical scriptures, for example, the Quran and the Bible.
Okay, so a lot has been said, but I just want to get some specifics out there so people can get a little bit more concrete about what we're talking about. You said that Walter Williams makes the claim in his book that Christianity is fairly recent. Exactly how recent are we talking? Can you expand a little bit about that?
Well, recent, more specifically, let's talk about the New Testament. Okay. He says that actually the New Testament was sanctioned by Pope Gregory XIII to create an allegorical story for the life of the Jesus Christ. And essentially, Desiderius Erasmus, this is particularly around the time of 15th century, 16th century, so around that time. Now, traditionally, in the scholarship, we taught that, no, it was 111 AD that we have proof of some Gospels and manuscripts. And what actually Walter Williams goes on to say is that Martin Luther, one of the main reasons why he also rebelled, essentially, is because he talks about how the New Testament was orchestrated by one of his peers, Desiderius Erasmus. So, and then he also goes forth to give a little bit more detail about it. He says that the first books were the Synoptic Gospels, which is Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And that in fact that John didn't come until later down. But traditionally, we have these books in a particular order that historically don't lie, according to Walter Williams.
So what does that mean in the bigger picture, in the sense, in the face of Christianity? So we know that, okay, these books and things weren't exactly, I guess, written when they said they were not together. So what does that mean? What's the purpose here?
Well, essentially, he talks about is that we need to educate ourselves due to the fact of our trust in the individuals who have been educating us. What he's saying that they have been educating, that they've been miseducating us. And you have a few other scholars that talk about the harmful effects of miseducation. When we look at the miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson, and essentially what Carter G. Woodson says, this person who gives you this information, misinformation for a hidden agenda, is doing so to control. So yeah.
Okay, so moving right along, Walter Williams also in the book, he talks about various contradictions within, I guess, the Bible or Christianity. Can you just expand upon more specifically what those contradictions are and the evidence that he uses to show that they're contradictions, and just expand upon that?
Okay. Well, he doesn't specifically say contradiction.
Okay.
Through him providing the information, it proves that there has to be a contradiction because the two sides saying two different things. So, what I mean by that, I mean that we have this traditional perspective of what we taught about how the Bible is formulated, and then we have the historian Walter Williams presenting something. So, naturally, there has a contradiction there.
So then, can you give me an example of that? Like, first tell us how...
Of the contradiction?
No, can you first tell us, I guess, how Christians believe the book is formulated, and then show the contradictions that Walter Williams sees in that?
Okay, well, traditionally, because I can't speak for an individual, what the most part they state is that the books were orchestrated approximately 50 to about 100 years after the life of Jesus Christ, 110 AD.
Yeah,
now, what Walter Williams states is that is incorrect, because we have Johannes Fuss through this particular mass printing press. And then we have the Serious Erasmus, who orchestrated this at this particular time. So he's saying that that's misinformation, because we have the Serious Erasmus who wrote that. So how can you have the Synoptic Gospels in a Hebrew translation when they haven't been written yet? So that's the contradiction between there. And then he goes into more things to show like the transition of particular gods. When we see we'll get into those particular things as we continue to go more into what he's saying about it, but that's just how he shows some of the contradiction, just by showing that example. So that's one example, and we'll get into some more examples.
Would you mind getting into some more examples now?
Okay. Well, sure. Well, the first thing a contradiction I want to point out is when we look at how, at that particular time of antiquity, how they looked at God, the status of God, or the status of a Savior. So, if we go a little back in history, we see that, Alexander the Greek, he came into Egypt around the year of 332 before Common Era. This is before the life of Christ, about 332 years before Christ. So what formulates here is that he wanted to become worshipped, equivalent to how they were worshiping the other particular deities. What we come to find out is that they weren't worshiping these deities in a religious way, but more so as paying homage to their ancient ancestors and noticing the harmonious things in nature. But Alexander the Greek, he wanted to be worshipped. Okay. Now, in his particular traditions, that's nothing new, because they were considered to be gods. Now, 10 years later, in 323 before Common Era, he was replaced by Ptolemy I. Now, Ptolemy I wanted to do the same thing as Alexander the Greek. Now, when Alexander the Greek died, he took their position over rule of Egypt. And he did numerous things of closing temples and refusing the ancient Egyptians and the Coptic priests to worship in their forms of matter, because they rejected his image in the particular temple. So and even when we look at a name that's been given to him, we see that he was also, Ptolemy I was called Satur. And Satur literally is a translation to Savior. So historically, we come to find out is that he was given the name Savior due to his military conquests. Okay, so that would be considered a contradiction, in the sense that Savior is supposed to be that who loved mankind and humanity, not one that destructs and destroys. That would be more so associated to an evil entity, more so like Satan.
But wouldn't we call that a mere contradiction of the human person? I mean, there's many things in this, life that we have that certain people can use, for certain reasons. And should we? I don't think it's fair because one person did that with the term savior and took it on to something else to exactly discredit, you know what I'm saying, the ideal of a savior later for other Christians or other people.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, it just shows us with the origin of how the Savior come into the picture. Why is this particular image called the Savior? And what we see is that